episode of the Conversation Show, the show where we have the conversations that maybe if more people were having, we would have. Well, today, our topic, a little more cultural intelligence in the world. This is what we're going to be talking about today. So, for those of you who are new to the Conversation Show, welcome. We are super happy to have you here. Here's the thing about the Conversation Show that's maybe a little bit different than some of the other shows you might participate in. As you might see, there are two of us here today, so we will be having a conversation. But it is not just for the two of us. It is for all of us who are here in the conversation today. So if you are here joining us live, please pop a comment in the comments. Let us know you're here. And also, as we go through the conversation, we would love to hear your comments, your perspectives, your experiences, your questions, anything that's coming up for you as you listen to this lovely conversation today. Samina, my friend, welcome back. Always great to see you. I know you are very passionate about this type of conversation, as is my lovely guest today, Litzy. So Litzy, would you please tell us a little bit more about you and why cultural intelligence is something that's so important to you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for inviting me to the show as well. So my name is Litzy Baeza. I use the pronouns she and her. I'm a full-time equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant, but I really started my work, and I do a lot of work around curriculum development, facilitation, strategies for organizations, etc. This field is so expansive, and there's lots to do. But I really started my career off in intercultural communication and competency. I started working with international students here in Edmonton, Alberta, very early on in my career in international education. These were students from different cultures and countries that would come to the U of A on short-term study abroad opportunities. And part of my role was to offer intercultural communication workshops to the students. And at that time, I really realized how important intercultural communication, cross-cultural communication, and ultimately cultural intelligence, which is what we're here to speak about, is so important, and particularly in this present context. This work for me started back in early 2000s. As I mentioned, I was working with Asian students, and I was having a real hard time with them engaging in classroom discussion. I would ask a question, everyone would look down, no one would say anything, and I really felt like they just weren't understanding what I was saying or were disengaged and not interested. I was expecting a Canadian cultural academic response from them. And I remember my supervisor, and he said, you really need to get some intercultural competency training to understand what it means to work with other cultures. And that's kind of where my passion started for intercultural communication competency, really understanding how cultures communicate with one another. And so a lot of the work that I've done is around intercultural communication, intercultural competency. But just recently, there's been a huge focus on cultural intelligence. And there was a huge focus on emotional intelligence a few years back. I think there still is some momentum around that. But I really think that emotional intelligence is a culturally conditioned skill. It's very dominant cultural narrative. For example, in certain cultures, you will never see how people feel, what emotions they may have, because within their culture, that's not appropriate or respectful, depending on who you're working with. And so cultural intelligence really is a skill that helps you, not only you working with other cultures, but yourself understand your own culture, your own cultural values, those behaviors that you may have, assumptions that we might make about other people. So it's really diving deep. In intercultural communication, we use the analogy of the iceberg. And actually the iceberg was the first analogy, because I've seen different analogies with the iceberg, but the iceberg, 80% of it is hidden, and 80% of that hidden iceberg is what we can't visibly see with our eyes. And culture hides many aspects that we can't easily see. Values being one of them. Values is hugely important, and cultural values will differ, right, based on our experiences, how we grew up, etc. And so really understanding those pieces, I think, takes these IQs or these IQ quotients a little bit higher, right? CQ is one of the 6 straight traits that have been identified for inclusive leadership. So it's really important that we tap into this.
Yeah. Okay. There's
Lots
so much there. I feel like there's an iceberg. That's an iceberg. Okay. So one of the things I want to actually start with is that the self-awareness of our own culture, because I know for myself, I've even said this before when I'm watching cultural celebrations. I've said to my husband, like, oh man, I wish we had like more cultural like goodness, right? I think a lot of times we look at this from I think we were watching a Chinese dragon dance or something like that. And we think about cultural differences in that type of framework. So what are some of the things we need to know, or some of the areas we need to investigate of our own culture before we can even start to get down to that underneath the waterline level?
Yeah, well, a lot of work that's done in equity, diversity, and inclusion is really uh, tapping into your own positionality, how you show up, right, socially, what your social location is. And that includes what your identity aspects are, what your identity markers may be, right? There's lots of different exercises nowadays to really tap into how you show up in the world. What do you consider good or bad? What are your morals around ethics, for example? Because it varies across cultures, right? You have cultures where I lived in Cuba for 6 years, and folks in Cuba, to survive, steal products to sell on the black market, but they don't consider that stealing. And so that really played with my value systems, right? What I consider good or bad within the context that I grew up in. For me, that's not considered good, right? But I'm in a different cultural context. So how do I kind of balance the two out? So it's really how you view the world, how you show up in the world, what you consider are rules. What are your rules? What are the values that you hold very deeply to yourself? For example, how do you view hierarchy, power? We can dive deeper. And what is your privilege, right? How do you show up with your privilege amongst your identity? So I think it's a combination of all those things to really understand how other folks might show up, right?
Okay, so there's a really interesting comment here. LinkedIn user, I'm not sure who you are, so if you want to pop your name in there because you've got good stuff. Personally, I think it's important to acknowledge that we belong to a variety of different cultures. We belong to our familial cultures, extended cultures, experiential cultures, and the different communities that we interact with. So what are your thoughts, Litzy, on this concept of, we're not actually trying to figure out what our one culture is, but we're trying to identify what are these multiple cultures we might participate in?
Yeah, and I agree with the person who made the comment. You have to tap into all those different cultures, right? Because it's not what, and I think that's what folks get stuck on sometimes when we talk about cultural intelligence and intercultural communication. It's just the cultural aspect. Right. Or when I ask folks to define diversity, automatically they just talk about cultural diversity, and we know diversity can show up in different aspects, right? So I think it's important to take in consideration all different cultures. There's a lot of frameworks that support intercultural communication that speak to how values, for example, show up across cultures. So how someone, for example, in Japan might view hierarchy versus someone in Canada, for example. And so these value systems, there's been a lot of criticism because it generalizes, I think, people into certain groups of culture. And there's been a lot of discussion, much like this comment that just came up, that we need to take into consideration all these other aspects of culture too, right?
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the word generalization. So where do we start to get into a danger category when we generalize these types of I don't even know, cultural activities, cultural values, beliefs? Where's the danger in like generalizing those?
So one of the so when we speak to CQ, the framework names four different quadrants, if you will. One of those quadrants is drive, or the motivation to be interested in learning about other people. Let's not say culture, diverse others. The second quadrant is about knowledge. So that knowledge includes your knowledge about a certain group of folks that you work with, maybe a certain type of culture. It includes things. And when we talk about culture, we also have to think of different ways people communicate. So what does communication look like? How about gestures? Like this in Canada means okay, but in Brazil it means F you. And so like really understanding that nonverbal communication that other cultures, or when we work with different people, that's what comes out, right? We've seen research that says 10% of communication is verbal and the rest is really nonverbal. So understanding that across diverse people is really important to understand. So I think for me, the knowledge piece of the CQ quadrant really dives deeper into what is that knowledge that I need to have, right? So it's not just about researching and learning about another culture. It might be how do folks communicate within that culture? How do folks view power? How do folks view risk? Etc. How do folks view rules and order and the way society kind of evolves? And so I think diving deeper into those aspects is really helpful for someone to, if you're wanting to increase your cultural intelligence, then you need to dive deep into those knowledge pieces.
Right. Okay. You use the word need. We need to understand. And I just wanted to break this down in terms of like, yeah, I believe that we should. These are good things to understand. They're helpful things to understand. But where does the conversation break when we're saying, like, us standing here being like, you need to do this, versus us finding that own internal drive? You talked about drive as one of the the quadrants. Like, how important is that, like, personal desire to be like, I want to learn about different cultures, I believe in the value of different perspectives? Like, how do we maybe ignite that drive? Because I think once we have it, there's like lots of ways that we can continue with that. But what are some ways that you've seen, Litzy, that can help maybe an organization who's trying to bring this type of intelligence into their leadership team? What are some of the things you've seen that work in terms of the ignition point?
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to have resistance. Like resistance in this space is more often sometimes than not, to be honest with you. But I think part of the quadrant is for you to have the drive. So it's not for others to have it. It's for you to want to do it. So if you're working in a multicultural team and you're a leader and you're wanting to advance equity and inclusion, then you're going to have that natural desire, right, to want to increase your cultural intelligence, whether it's through training, through education. There's lots of different resources today around cultural intelligence that's taking precedence. And so I think it's for you. You can't force anyone to want to do it, right?
Yeah.
I think the more that organizations have this conversation and are willing to provide training or coaching or whatever that might look like, I think there's also there the desire from folks, right, within that organization to want to continue to do things.
Mm-hmm. So before I go to Samina's question, how important is it from a leadership perspective to be paying attention to the team's drive in these areas?
Well, they need to have drive first, right? The leader needs to have
Yeah.
the drive. So I think it's by asking folks, what motivates you? How are you motivated by, wanting to increase your desire to advance inclusion and equity? Because ultimately that's what we're doing, right? With a
Right.
skill like cultural intelligence. And to be honest with you, I've seen such an uptake of I deliver so many workshops on EDI related topics. And there's such an uptake from folks across Canada and other parts too to want to do this work. So I think that motivation is there for most people, right? You want to understand how to work with diverse others. You want those skills. So I think it's a natural desire. Like I said, there's some resistance, and sometimes it's leadership resistance too, right? Or not knowing how to do it. So that's why I think like education around CQ is really important.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I've experienced historically is this like leadership buy-in conceptually, like, okay, we believe in EDI, so we are going to make available these cultural intelligence workshops with Litzy once a month for our employees who are like ready to go on that part of the journey. But then people take the workshop and then the organization ignores what they know.
Yeah,
So, I mean, and like, I don't really know that there's an easy way to say, like, this is fixable, but I always think this is really just about being honest with ourselves, is that if you have that personal drive, go and find a way to learn more about that, to
right.
increase your knowledge. And if you don't have that personal drive, then I don't know, maybe start by investigating it. Why don't I care about these things?
Yeah,
Because I also think that there's, like, to some degree, like you said, like ethics, or this would be good to value this, right? Like I should value cultural intelligence, but maybe there's something else in your experience that's making something rank higher, and this is an opportunity for you to explore, like, okay, why do I not want to? My entire leadership team is all into this, right? But I go to the training and I'm like, this is a waste of my time, right? Well, just think, explore.
yeah. I think a lot of times organizations will come to consultants like me when they're like in dire straits, right? I've seen it where organizations have locations around the world and the Mexican team can't get along with the German team, right? And so it's like when something happens is when this becomes important. CQ isn't a skill that I've seen taken in most organizations, to be honest with you.
Right.
The one course I think that exists in Edmonton is the one that I teach at NATE. And so I don't see it being taken too seriously quite yet.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that changes based on conversations like this. Okay, so let's go to Sam's question here. So, how do you balance multiculturalism? You're now assuming that we have all these different people in our organizations that have different cultures, and we've done that knowledge exploration. So, we have that. I mean, I'm sure we could build that knowledge for forever, but we've done that knowledge deep dive to some degree, so I can understand these different cultures are happening. So now how do we balance that? Or do we balance that?
So I think multiculturalism has been around since the 1970s as a policy, right? So I think for most parts, Canadians are really familiar with multiculturalism. If I understand the question correctly, is how do we balance different cultures, right,
Mhm.
in the workplace? I think again, as you're moving towards more inclusion and equitable practices within workplaces, you need to be able to balance different cultures. And having a skill like cultural intelligence helps with that because, again, you're diving deep into how other folks view different things, right? Like values, what's good, what's bad, ethics, silence, nonverbal communication. So it helps you tap into how to communicate more effectively with folks that come from different cultures, right? I think before the onus was always on the newcomer or the immigrant to do the work, right? When I started in this field, most of the workshops really focused on newcomers, immigrants, international students getting intercultural competency training,
Right.
but the onus was never on the Canadian side. So now we're seeing, Canadian workplaces and Canadian academic institutions understanding what it means within their context to work with folks that are that from different cultures. So in the academic institution, for example, you have lots of different international students that come, and one of the challenges is plagiarism or copyright. How to do that in other countries? It just isn't a thing,
Right.
right? We can't. We part of cultural intelligence is leaving behind your ethnocentricity as well, and understanding that the way we do things here isn't necessarily the correct or only
Right.
way.
Yeah.
Right? That's a part of cultural intelligence that's really important, is to drop those ethnocentric views that we have of, okay, well, we do plagiarism is look like this in Canada, and this is how we do it. But also understanding, how do you explain to international students this is the way that we do things, right? How can you be flexible when it comes to that, right?
Mhm. And so it's just interesting because I think someone had commented on the post for this event, a definition of culture in terms of like the way we do things here.
Yeah.
And I think there's a tendency for us to say like the way we do things here is the right way to do things here. And so when we're looking at this cultural intelligence perspective, how important of a skill is it to say, like, being wrong? Like, I am actually open to exploring your way of doing that without making myself wrong or bad. How important is that as a component in being able to actually have cultural intelligence?
It's really important, even like to, intercultural communication frameworks have ladders, or frameworks that are like ladders, where you're going from ethnocentrism to, maybe integration or adaptation. It works mostly for folks that go to another culture, right? Or explore cultures, or go and live and work in other cultures. But I think it's really important, even to work with diverse others and wanting to advance inclusion and equity, that you leave your ethnocentrism behind. You explore that, right? You want to know what it is that, what are your ethnocentric views, what might be some unconscious biases you may have, what are some assumptions that you're making maybe, and kind of work through that, right? A lot of this work is intentional. So you have to spend time diving deep into why you feel the way that you do about a certain thing, right?
Mhm.
It might be an interaction and you're not feeling too great about it. Write it down. Part of the CQ 4 quadrant model is action and strategy.
Mm.
And what does that look like, right? When you're having an interaction with diverse others.
Mhm. Okay, so my background is marketing. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I'm thinking is like, how does this play? So like how does cultural intelligence come to life in like a go to market strategy? So if I'm a business, I've got marketing, maybe marketing materials going out in different countries and different languages. I've got sales reps in different countries taking sales actions that are aligned culturally in one place, but potentially not culturally aligned in another place. Do you have any advice for how to create the freedom in that, but also an alignment in that, so that we feel like, yes, we're moving forward as a business, yet we're giving our regions that freedom to incorporate their own culture?
Yeah, I think part of DEI is inviting folks right to the
Right.
table. getting those perspectives, right? And I think that's important in anything that you do, especially when it comes to marketing. I've worked in countries where it's usually, you know, the North American way of doing things, the marketing way, and they don't invite anyone to ask, okay, what is it? Here, within your cultural context that we should take into consideration?
Right.
What are some things that you think might not be appropriate? How many marketing faux pas have there been? Like, there's been so
A
many.
lot.
And I always ask myself, what do they even have someone like an intercultural specialist or a cultural intelligence specialist in the background giving them advice on this? Because like it's amazing to me sometimes the faux pas that have been had just recently, like within this present context. So you need to have folks there advising you and letting you know, okay, well, this is appropriate, this might not be appropriate, maybe consider this. Even colors, like, there's certain colors in different cultures that are, appropriate, and there's other colors that aren't. The way that you're using your hands, the yes, no, like, it's just so many different things that you have to take into consideration that I think that a lot of times you don't invite the right people to ask those questions.
Right. Yeah, I love how you frame it as getting the right people to ask the right questions, because I don't think that there's like one set of answers. There's like every
No,
different
yeah,
combination of people is going to give you a different combination of answers. And when we have those people at the table, regardless of if, like, okay, maybe I'm a marketing expert, so I'm at the table, but I'm not the cultural expert in what it's like to do business in Greece. So I need somebody who wants to be the cultural perspective in the conversation. And do they have to be the one making the like final decision? Maybe not, but there's a like sitting at the table, but not sitting at a table just to say you gave someone a seat at the table, like giving
yeah,
someone an ear at the
yeah,
table, to be
exactly.
like, you're here because I want your perspective, I appreciate your perspective, and as different as it might be from mine, it is critical component to the conversation. So let's see, in the work that you do, how much of this is, because we've talked about communication. Well, I think we can dive into that a little bit more, but how much of it is communication, but also that like self-awareness that I'm willing to be shown perhaps a bias or a perspective that I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, I never thought about that before.
Yeah, no, I think self-awareness is a big piece, and self-awareness will open up the keys to communication and all of these, right? Different aspects. Being self-aware of how you communicate things versus how someone else might receive it. So, like, for example, in that example I gave you about the Mexicans and the Germans not getting along, the Germans were quite assertive, and their Germans are very direct communicators. They say exactly what is meant, and everything is kind of orderly, on time, task related. Whereas the Mexicans is more about relationship building, right? They might not say things directly because they don't want to hurt the other side. So how do both parties become aware? They both need to be aware, right, of how they're communicating and how they might change their communication pattern a little bit to ensure that the other side understands it. So I think a lot of it has to do about becoming self-aware. And again, a lot of this work takes time. It's being intentional, it's being more mindful. A lot of times I hear people say, we just don't have the time. We
Right.
don't have the time to do this. Well, if you want to do it, you need to find the time.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, I'm like thinking about that example, right? And how much time, effort, energy, budget is wasted in those conversations between those two parties that are not being productive.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times when it comes down to the time conversation, we're not looking at the wasted time that is happening because of these problems. And if we took that time and assigned it here, instead into some cultural intelligence training, or even having a conversation facilitated by somebody who is culturally aware, there's so many opportunities. I think there's more opportunities than we think to not spend more time and not spend more money, but to be more intentional with our actions.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I find a lot of organizations spend time, like you said, they waste time on conversations. If you know you're working abroad, you know you need to bring someone in to kind of help with that. A lot of relocation companies have intercultural specialists around the world that help people that are assigned to other countries work through those intercultural communication barriers that might pop up. And so you need to allocate resources to these like you said, facilitated conversations, training, whatever that might look like, right? But it needs to happen.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a question about authenticity, because authenticity is something that's really important to me. So when we're looking at the balancing activities, and like I like direct communication, but the person who's receiving this doesn't like direct communication. Like how do we puzzle these things together so that we don't have a whole bunch of people in our team that then are feeling like the Germans are getting frustrated because they feel like they have to walk on eggshells around the Mexican team? And like, how do we create space for authenticity and cultural intelligence simultaneously?
It's tough. I mean, it's really difficult. There's different things you can do. So, for example, in the example that I provided about me starting off working with Asian students and me feeling that they were disengaged, that they weren't really wanting to um, provide their input. Well, that's not going to change for them, right? Whatever I do, that's how they're going to show up. So what happened there is, because in Japanese culture and Korean culture, seniority is very much respected. What I did within that group is I found the most senior person within that group that I could speak to in a more direct manner. And that's how we were able to get engagement through that. So there's different strategies I think that you can do depending on the cultural context. So if it's the Germans, for example, maybe it's assigning a spokesperson on the German side that can communicate a little bit better to the Mexican side, or vice versa. It's about adjusting, I think, right? Because you still, like, as you said, want to be authentic and genuine, but you have to work through some of these issues that can become very cumbersome if you don't.
Yeah. I think this is so true. And this is Allison, our LinkedIn user, Allison. What if we make a big stumble over an unintentional cultural topic? Which is something that came up, right? These are likely something that's going to happen. And there's a lot of conversation in EDI about the impact versus the intention, right? So, what are some ways we can recover to some degree from such an unintentional cultural faux pas?
Yeah, I think apologizing, right? Just, letting folks know that you didn't know, right? It's something that you're new to. I think folks take once you explain things, I think for the most part, we take things well, right? We understand. I think it's communicating that we didn't understand, and how might I be able to learn. I think what's important in any EDI kind of faux pas and recovering from it is accountability, and what that looks like, right? Accountability is key. So it's not just apologizing and saying, I'm sorry. What are you doing to ensure this won't happen again? And that might mean educating yourself, right, on whatever it might be. It might be making remedies to the person that was hurt, right? So I think there's a variety of different ways that you can do this, but it's taking accountability, and what that looks like is going to be different for every situation and every person. But understanding that you need to do more than just apologizing is really important.
Yeah, I think that's something I hear over and over again in these types of things, is that it's one thing to apologize, like, I didn't know that, right? But like, if you don't do anything different next time, but you also don't recognize that you've had an impact on somebody, right?
Yeah.
Like, yes, this was not my intention, and it had this negative impact on you, instead
Yes.
of like creating that as like two separate things. Like, I'm not responsible for this impact that it had on you because it wasn't my intention of doing that. Right. And you're like, okay, it may not have been your intention, and it had this impact on this person. And
Yeah.
this is the thing. I feel like creating that connection is so important because, I mean, for people like me, I don't have an intention of offending people culturally, but I only have my experience to base things on. And I have a white Canadian middle class experience that I'm basing a lot of my knowledge on. And it's been, I mean, one of my parts of my journey, I was totally that person in the early part of my journey, right? I'll admit to it, who was like, well, that wasn't my intention. Okay, that might be true. And it still had this impact on this person. And being able to create those ands for me and a cultural intelligence perspective has been really helpful because it allows me to hold myself accountable, but not to like punish myself for like, I didn't know. I won't do it again, but I can't go back and know that I can't go back in time.
Yeah.
So creating that, like, that all inclusive, like, it wasn't my intention and it had this impact, and what am I going to do about it?
Yeah.
So that I don't have that same impact on a recurring basis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any tips for us on like how to puzzle those things together so that we can start holding ourselves or our companies or our coworkers or our family members even accountable for the future?
Yeah, there's so many great resources, right? That really speak to accountability practices, what they should look like. Mia Mungus, for example, has a great accountability framework. And she also explains ways that you can apologize to people. There's the whole calling in, calling out, right? Kind of, what do I do there? So I think there's different resources today that you can find through different organizations across Canada and in the United States that have some of these tools to help you understand what does accountability look like. One of the things that I do within the places that I work is I really ask folks to think about what an accountability practice might look like for their organizations.
I think that's, again, similar point we were making before. There's not like one accountability version that maybe works for all people or all companies, but having a framework in place is, I mean, this is what we got to do. And I think it's important too I want to just quickly chat about this because I feel like there's a lot of the times in the conversations that I'm a part of, like, well, I've been trying, right? I've been trying to be understanding and learn about this, but the other people like don't want to let me in. So I give up, right? And like in this, even like the accountability processes, right? We might have tried something that we thought, okay, so I made this faux pas. I had this accountability practice, except my accountability practice failed me and I did it again. Shoot. So what's a mindset then that really helps us in those, like, yeah, if we're going to explore in this arena, we're probably gonna make unintentional cultural missteps. And how do we stay committed to moving forward and continuing to learn when maybe sometimes we're feeling like, man, I just like can't get this right. I might as well not talk to people of this type because I'm just going to get it wrong.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. Like, again, I'll go back to what I said about wanting to advance equity and inclusion. You need to have this mindset. You need to be comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations. You need to be okay with being called out if you make a mistake. Part of being an ally is really taking on this work, right? And I always tell folks, you don't define yourself as an ally. It's those equity deserving groups that define you being an ally.
Mhm.
And so I think if you want to move towards that, then you need to be okay with all of this. You need to be okay with walking in this space sometimes between the gray areas, right? Because you will make mistakes and you will feel guilt and you will feel shame for certain things, right? You know, there's a lot of talk nowadays, there's open conversation. And I think a lot of people from equity deserving groups have had enough emotional labor, to be honest with you, in describing their experiences or educating others. It's time for other folks to start educating themselves.
Mhm. I think they're great points. Okay, Sam's got another great question here. When you have differences, who is expected to change? Is it the person in the minority group? Because as you mentioned, Litzy, that's kind of the historical trend, is that we're going to teach the minority group, the newcomers to the country, how to behave here. But what are some pieces of that conversation we need to take into consideration when we're, I mean, I'm gonna let you go first because I have some thoughts.
Yeah, I don't like the word minority, first of all. It just
Yeah.
it just denotes people into like a lower class. I also think we need to walk away from this dominant cultural narrative of who's right and who's wrong. I
Right.
think if there's a difference, you both need to work through it. I don't think it's the minority of the group at all. Like that automatically just states that there's a dominant culture and we
Right.
want to try to stay away from that, right? And so yeah, I think that's something that both parties need to do, not just someone who's in an underrepresented group.
Mm-hmm. This was something that I was going to say too, right? Is if we are actually in this together, right? This is a teacher and student relationship. My job as the teacher is to teach you. Your job as the student is to learn. As far as I'm concerned, I have lots of students that learn in different ways. So there's like something I need to do. If we're on business teams that are going together in the same direction, and Sam is saying the smaller demographic in the group. But either way, right? Like if you are, I mean, I'll just use, I've been the only woman in a room, right?
Yeah.
I have different perspectives. I am the smaller demographic. Is it just like now there's all men, so I have to change to like match the energy and match that? Like that doesn't feel teamy for me. So if we're actually doing this as a team, then there is that you give, I give, and we find a way to make this work. It's not your job to make this work. It's not my job 100% to make it work. It's our job to make it work. So how are we working together to make it work?
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm going to do last call for questions from the audience. So if you guys have any more questions, get them in there right now. In terms of, so you talked about cultural dominance. I think this is an important piece not to just like skim over. That I think this is something to look at. Like, do I think I'm part of the like culturally dominant group? Because if so, then maybe I should explore that a little bit more. But what does this look like when we have like, we're in a business, so there's like a corporate culture, and then we all have our own individual cultures to some degree. How do you see that in like corporate work environments in terms of being like, this is the corporate culture, and now therefore it's become the dominant culture over like your individual culture? One, have you seen that? And two, how does that play into the like, every time you hear the word dominance, I think of like power, right? So now we have a power dynamic that's happening in the organization. So how does that concept of now my business has the dominant culture, how does that impact our ability to like truly belong in an organization?
Well, I think that's where inclusion and equity come in, right? Understanding, one of the things I always say about advancing equity and inclusion is understanding the employees that work with you. And let's move away from organizational culture and find how to ensure that individuals thrive within their positions and can show up as they are. So part of that is understanding who your employees are. And then adequately implementing and developing inclusion strategies or practices. so that folks can come to the workplace and we can all be authentic, right?
Mhm.
And it's not just the dominant cultural way. I think a lot of organizations are talking more and more about decolonization. I'm completely for decolonization. I think we need to unlearn certain ways of doing things and look outside of this just black and white paradigm that we always look at.
Yeah, I think that one of the analogies that I always use is that a company, there's like a DNA structure of a company, and each strand of DNA is a person. So I have my own unique knowledge, expertise, culture that is feeding that DNA. And I think, I mean, especially from a marketing perspective, I feel like it's always been like, this is the company brand and no one cares what your brand is. You're just going to be this. And it's just like, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. People can't have their own personal culture squashed out of them. It doesn't matter how hard you push. And when we can give ourselves that permission as an organization to look at this as like, how beautiful is this unique strand of DNA, because it has all these unique pieces. And if I erase the uniqueness of that piece, I actually erase the uniqueness of my business. How can I look at this from a different perspective? So I love that, because this may seem like a random question, but it's something I think about often in terms of job descriptions, because I think a lot of job descriptions are very prescriptive, right? Like, I need you to do these kinds of tasks.
Yes.
How might that look differently if I'm now hiring from a culturally intelligent point of view to like optimize my DNA as an organization instead of just trying to fill a role?
Yeah. And I think the recruitment and hiring practice, I mean, you could do a whole show on that, because I think like you can really think outside the box when it comes to that. I mean, I have lots of different ideas of how you can make it a little bit more culturally intelligent, inclusive, and equitable. So I think, like I said, thinking outside of the box, not doing the same thing that we're so used to doing, these behavioral questions, etc. Like, what can we do differently to ensure that we're bringing in folks, that can be diverse within an organization.
Okay, we have one more comment here and then we'll start wrapping up. So Andrew, always good to see you, my friend. He's saying, I'm from Montreal, Quebec, and I struggle sometimes he switched this to say, explain the Quebec culture. And I wanted just to touch on this concept of feeling like we have to explain our culture instead of someone else like being curious about our culture. So how do we balance that in like, it kind of going back to the who's responsible, right? Like, am I responsible for explaining my culture to people? Are people responsible for being curious about my culture to me? Like, how does that balance get optimized?
Well, I also understand the question as that he's in Montreal right now and probably needs to explain the Quebec culture to other folks. And so I think that's important. If you're in another culture, you really need to understand where you are and what that looks like. And Quebec culture is different than the rest of Canadian culture, right? So it's really important, if you're immersed in another place that you really haven't been immersed in before, understanding what that looks like, right? So that you can explain appropriately. Lionel Laroche, Laroche, is a predominant intercultural researcher here in Canada. He does a lot of work on the differences between Quebec culture and other parts of Canada.
There, great resource for the knowledge part of your quadrant in your cultural intelligence quadrant. Yes. Awesome. This has been really insightful today, Litzy. I'm going to encourage all of you in the comments to connect with Litzy. And where would be the best place for people to do that?
LinkedIn. Yeah. Litzy Baeza, Baeza, is a great way to connect with me.
Awesome. And she is tagged in the post, so you can just click on her name and find her and connect and let her know that you met at the show. So she knows what you know. Well, a teeny bit of what you know about her anyways. Thank you so much for sharing so many great insights today, Litzy, and so many more. So connect with Litzy. I'm sure she'd be glad to share, and I know that she does on her profile and through workshops and everything as well. For those of you who are in the chat, if you're not already connected to each other, make sure you connect with each other, because these are the people who are interested in the cultural intelligence conversation. And if that is a conversation that is intriguing to you, please do not let this be the last time you're hanging out in a conversation about that. Let it be the first time of many times. This is where we get to try on these concepts and build our cultural intelligence and get more curious about ourselves and get more curious about others. So thank you everyone for participating in the chat today. Great questions, great knowledge sharing from Litzy. And until next time, everybody, permission to do you.
Thank you.